Alexa Clay. Alexa Clay, her work is at the edges. When she co-authored the book, The Misfit Economy, she got worldwide attention and recognition for exploring underground and informal innovation. Love it. Alexa believes the underworld is filled with natural-born innovators, and they have more in common with Silicon Valley entrepreneurs or Exxon than you might think. And today, she's working to create more inclusive and innovation ecosystems in cities and regions across the US. Alexa hacks, she hustles, she provokes systems that need change. Her current research is focused on inclusive growth, universal basic income, economic democracy, creativity and education, and her background is in 18th and 19th century moral philosophy and economic theory. Hey! We'll do our 3-hour lecture together. Based on these ideas, Alexa holds workshops and salons that tap into participants' elastic personal identity, love that, as a key to transforming their careers, behaviors, and thought patterns. And you know those icebreakers where you were asked where you would like to sit and have dinner with if you could pick anyone in the world? Well, I might pick Alexa Clay. So our next speaker, please join me in applauding Alexa.
Amazing. It's great to be here. Thanks everyone for having me. I wanted to start just with a simple question. Just by a show of hands, how many people here have ever done anything illegal? Okay, take note. All right, so the room is already full of misfits. And what I wanted to share with you is just some of the research I've been doing for the past 5 years now, looking at innovation and creativity happening in the informal economy, happening in the underground. Over $10 trillion takes place in the informal economy, in these gray markets, in these black markets. In some countries, over 60% of the economy is informal. And yet we never read about these case studies in Harvard Business Review or in mainstream periodicals. And so I really want to put the spotlight today on misfits and some of the underground practices that we can learn from. How can we learn from hermits, from hackers, from drug dealers and hustlers? And it sounds like there might be a few in the room, so we can harvest that later. So my own background, origin story, I really grew up the product of two misfits. Both my parents were anthropologists. My father grew up on a small farm and then ended up working in the Brazilian Amazon. And so he was someone who created some of the first fair trade supply chains. And this wasn't popular at the time because at the time there was a belief that indigenous communities needed to be preserved rather than develop opportunities in terms of incorporating people and bringing up their livelihoods. So he faced a lot of pushback and was ostracized a bit by the anthropology community. Meanwhile, my mother traveled around the world and talked to people who thought they'd been abducted by aliens. So this was deeply frightening for me as a child, especially at 8. And then as I sort of grew in confidence, by like 13, I was just really bummed out that I hadn't been abducted. I felt like, yeah, I'm still waiting. Like maybe this, my Portland trip will have this phenomenon happen. But so growing up with these anthropological parents really taught me the value of speaking to people who make us uncomfortable, people who aren't in our echo chambers or aren't part of our everyday world. And so I started looking for these misfit stories everywhere, learning, for example, that franchising, this kind of clever business innovation we associate with groups like Starbucks and McDonald's, was something that gangs and Hell's Angels had been using way before it had been co-opted by corporate America. Figuring out that video streaming that we take for granted in devices like Amazon and Netflix and Hulu was actually something that was pioneered within the porn industry. And so always thinking about, well, what are the things that are happening in some of these shadows economies that we can learn from? What are the technologies that are being used? What are different ways of organizing? For example, with historic pirate cultures, pirates, before Western European countries had democracies, pirates were beginning to experiment with democratic ways of organizing aboard their vessels. They were also thinking about having more equal pay structures. So if you think about the huge gap in pay between CEOs and the lowest paid worker at a company, pirates were developing innovative and egalitarian ways of splitting income. And here are some of the other protagonists that I spoke to. Play a quick video. Sound of
One law made, other laws made to break it.
Lovely. So there you saw some of the different protagonists that I spent the last 5 years interviewing. It was an exhaustive search. It was amazing to just get out of my little LinkedIn social impact bubble and begin talking to people and building relationships with people that I would never have met. And the purpose of a lot of this work in the end was to really transform our picture of the entrepreneur. So often when we think of entrepreneurs, we think of this like Silicon Valley wunderkind who, if you're over the age of 30, you're obsolete in terms of being brilliant anymore. And so what I wanted to show instead was this portrait that entrepreneurship is an innate human instinct. It's everywhere. That if you're a successful drug dealer, that you're an amazing entrepreneur, that you know how to build out a quality product, how to recruit customers, how to manage employees. Like maybe you're less good at risk management because you end up in prison quite often, but that actually you have this amazing entrepreneurial skill set. And some of the most charismatic leaders that I've met have been underground innovators. Here are just a few. We did a book launch in New York and brought 3 old school hustlers to the stage to interact with entrepreneurs and people within the tech scene. So here we have David Victorson, who has the mic. He actually started out selling weed to Harvard students. So he grew up in Boston, which is where I'm from. And then famously smuggled 37 tons of marijuana from Colombia to Seattle and got busted. So he was in prison. When he got out of prison, he successfully set up a series of rehabilitation clinics. And so he's someone that really shows that you can actually pivot that underground hustler instinct into the formal economy. And so he became a millionaire setting up these rehab clinics. In the middle, you have George Young, who Johnny Depp famously played in the movie Blow, big-time cocaine trafficker. And then over on the far right, you have King Tone. He was one of the first people I spoke to doing this project, and I was just floored. One of the first things he pushed back on is he was the leader of the Latin Kings, and he said, "Don't call us a gang, call us an organization." And his point working with the Latin Kings was to figure out how he could bring this street gang, which had really criminalized in the 70s and 80s, but whose origins started out as a Latino solidarity movement at the beginning to create more opportunities for Latinos in Chicago and then scaled throughout the prison system. And so he really actively was thinking about, well, how do we use these gang structures and do some internal change management, try and refresh those cultures and make them valuable sources where people can get, skills training and valuable sort of mentorship opportunities where people can learn activist skills. So he formed all these partnerships when he was the leader of this gang to try and help young gang members really develop themselves and develop better relationships with the outside world. And he wasn't always successful. I think we'll hear later from Maggie around this entrepreneurship task. But he was someone that faced enormous pushback from the gang because they were in the business of being stealth and under the radar. They were in the business oftentimes of murder and drug trafficking. And so to change the DNA of this organization was enormously hard. And so after this book launch, we actually had a nun who came and had a convent nearby, and so she invited all the Latin kings to come to the convent. And that was just beautiful for me because I think part of what I was trying to do with the book was to say, how do we shake up and cross all these different pockets of social capital of networks that we have? And so it was incredible to see these nuns host all these urban young Latin king leaders and to have enormous respect for some of the spiritual traditions that they were developing. So that's a little bit of some of the underground misfits. We also harvested a number of lessons and insights that came throughout all these interviews. So I'm not going to dwell on them here, but I did want to tell you a few stories. The first was looking at this principle of decentralization. And so often within today's kind of capitalist economy, we find ourselves working for these very command and control systems, for systems that are deeply hierarchical. And one thing I loved about speaking to groups like Anonymous or hacker collectives is the spirit of egalitarianism that ran through a lot of these groups, where you can function in these collectives in a world without bosses. And I thought that was a powerful provocation for thinking about, well, how do we transition the contemporary workforce into more of these kind of collectivist structures? Another place that I draw inspiration was from con artists. So this is a famous con artist called Gregor McGregor, roughly active, yeah, sounds bogus. That should have been the first turn on people, but he was a Scottish con man, and he basically developed an entirely fictitious colony called Poyais in modern-day Honduras. So this was around 1820. He attracted over 800,000 pounds in terms of a bank loan to finance this colony. And he recruited over 200 settlers, only all of whom boarded a ship to go to this colony. Meanwhile, this colony does not exist. It's entirely fake. And so what made him successful? The reason he was able to trick so many people is because he really made this colony come to life. He had a fake natural history that he developed and commissioned. He gave fake titles. He had banknotes and currencies. He gave an account of the natives that were there. And so at every kind of stop, he developed all these artifacts to make this real for people. And so sometimes when I think about storytelling or when I think about the incredible pitches that we saw earlier, it makes me think, well, what would a con artist do? How do we not just do the typical kind of PowerPoint presentation? How do we actually get people to believe in these worlds and these futures that we're trying to create? And so, as much as they're kind of snarky and evil, and unfortunately in this case, only 20 of the 200 made it back alive from the colony because it was entirely disease infested. And so, I'm not trying to glamorize these practices, but really just to say, can we have empathy and can we see some of the inherent innovation and creative practice that are in some of these misfit entrepreneurs? Similarly, I've always had this real love of hermits. So grew up in Boston outside of Walden Pond, and I think in a time when we're so focused on external innovation, that hermits offer a radical critique of the society that we're now living in. Around the time of the 1880s, 1890s, during this industrial boom in America, there was a lot of anti-hermit discourse because hermits weren't good consumers. So they weren't, personas that were well adapted to the economy that we were starting to create. And so they were heavily critiqued. Anyone who had sort of a hermit identity built around sort of this back to the land instinct. At the same time, within Victorian culture, hermits were prided. There were classifieds for wealthy people who sought hermits to be these like ornamental decorations on their properties. So I don't know if you can see that, but that's such a classified ad. And also there are e-newsletters for hermits. So I was delighted to discover a way in which hermits stay connected and so have that social instinct by connecting with other hermits and sharing what it's like for them to live more plainly. And so I think now we see more radical experiments of people that are trying to unplug, that can draw a bit of inspiration from these hermits. Another subculture that I've been fascinated by is live action role-playing or LARPing. How many people, by a show of hands, have ever done a LARP? Yeah, this crew. Nice. All right, these are like resident nerds you guys should talk to afterwards. But yeah, I just was initially fascinated and then started participating in more live action role-playing games. For those who don't know, it's often a kind of nerdy pastime that you associate with people like developing fantasy situations and running around in the woods with swords, but it's actually gotten to be a lot more sophisticated. And so you can set up a live action role play around any kind of situation that you'd want. We actually developed, took an old castle outside of Paris and set up a zero waste society that felt a lot like a LARP. And so rather than talking about, well, how do we transition our society to a more sustainable future and have these very theoretical conversations where we're trying to like convince people to be sustainable, we said, no, let's just do it. Let's create it. Let's embody it, and let's see what works and didn't. Part of the learning here was, in this zero waste society, we spent so much time putting energy into the technologies that would drive zero waste, as opposed to how we could be together as a group. How do we develop culture together? And so that was actually one of my roles, being very technologically limited, was to figure out, well, how do we grow relational culture together? And so I think this is wonderful to actually begin to pop up more of these kinds of games to figure out, if we're talking about the future of finance or talking about the future of relationships, how do we start to embody some of that through these game designs? This is another practice that I've taken from Misfits, which is alter ego development. So early on, I spent time interviewing Amish communities and was just fascinated by the reticence they have towards technology. So they have beta testers within Amish communities that will test out technologies before they're widely adopted. And I think too often we're sort of first adopters and we take on these technologies without really thinking about, well, what is the effect this digital platform is going to have on my privacy, on my health, on my sense of well-being. And so I wanted to try and bring this Luddite perspective. And so I bought this vintage prairie dress and started wearing a bonnet and would go to these tech conferences as this Amish woman called Rebecca. And it was really fun. It was just great because if you're dressed up as an Amish woman at a tech conference, everyone wants to talk to you. And then I was able to tap into a very different identity than I could if I was just Alexa Clay. So as this Amish woman, I developed a kind of gentle way of asking these Socratic questions to tech founders about, well, what's the bigger meaning behind what you're developing? And I think my lack of participation in sort of industrial society meant that people were super open and candid, and some even had sort of bigger existential crises about why they were doing what they were doing. And so this was powerful as a kind of provocation for thinking about ethics within the tech space, but I think the practice of alter egos more broadly actually brings out this enormous elasticity that we have inside of us. And so we often, inherit these identities, or the moment that I started doing this research on misfit economy, I had to buy alexaclay.com and package myself as like a commercial brand, and it felt terrible. And so I think part of my pursuit of alter egos was to decommodify some of my personality and some of the ways I felt like I was being forced to develop. And so I think alter egos are a wonderful creative pastime for accessing these different parts of ourselves that might be a little bit more dormant. This is a little bit just more about the Amish and what they can teach us about, healing Silicon Valley today. But I think going along with this Amish persona was also appreciating conventionality, appreciating the slowness of things. Within Amish newspapers, there are advertisements for cell phones and different kinds of technologies, but all the cell phone ads promise the plainness of the cell phone. It's built around a value proposition which says no distracting apps, like really only for placing calls. And so there's a way in which the simplicity of certain products are really taught to the consumer. And so found that really inspiring and part of this way of escaping a tech ecosystem where we feel bombarded constantly for this lack of attention. And so I think overall now I'm stepping into this mission of thinking about how do we begin to nurture some of these misfit subcultures. I don't think the answer is, for everyone to go be a hermit or for people to suddenly develop this appetite to be a hardcore member of Anonymous or to start a drug business. But I think the question is, how do we bring more alternatives into mainstream culture? And so this is actively something that I'm doing now, really built around this metaphor of drafting, which just starts with simple relationships. If we want to bring a little bit more of that hacker or hustler or alter ego energy into regular mainstream institutions, how do we invite people in that don't often have that access? And so my work now is really focused on that feat of developing more inclusive innovation and creating the boundaries for that. So thank you.